Okay. Hi, everyone. Sorry for all the technical difficulties. So my ghU is going to be about Black Lives Matter and focusing specifically on sites of tension from the local United States context to the global context. We're going to focus on Uganda and the United States in particular. And so just to preface all this, I do want to just present like the nuances and offer a new way of thinking. I definitely acknowledge that Black Lives Matter is like the proper noun is very much a United States thing, and the foundation is based in the US, the UK, and Canada, but also it's become a more grassroots thing that has extended beyond the United States border and really played a role in grassroots social justice movements, particularly to address the racism that the Black community has faced worldwide. And next slide, please. And so just to put it all out there, so my positionalities are that I'm Vietnamese American, I'm part of the middle class, a cisgender woman, and also a budding anthropologist, which means my views and ways of thinking are really shaped by this discipline. And I also want to acknowledge the Ramaytush people who are the original caretakers of the land in San Francisco and the Bay Area. They are still very much around despite the erasure that our settler colonial society has put forth. And I also have to acknowledge the genocide that was caused by the California Spanish missions. Next slide, please. So we're going to start off with the local movement, which is very much the United States, focusing on issues of police brutality and what I call the criminal injustice system. Next slide, please. And to start off, I found this graphic that put together a list of names of Black lives that were lost due to police brutality and the criminal injustice system in the United States. This is not a complete list, of course. There are other people who have not gotten the same media attention, but these are the people that are listed. And so it's important to keep in mind their lives that have been lost in the family and the hurt and pain that they've been put through. Next slide, please. So Black Lives Matter started as a hashtag in July 2013 as a response to the acquittal of George Zimmerman, who was a man that shot Trayvon Martin, an African-American teenager in Florida. And the picture down here has 3 women who created the hashtag. Their names are Alicia Garza, Patrice Koldler, and Opal Tomet. And their whole motivation behind this hashtag was really calling for institutional and systematic change. And it's really important to take note of how they maximize use of social media, especially in 2013 when Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, all those things were just starting out, and also just the use of hashtags. So they really linked together the physical and virtual spaces, protests and march happening on the ground, and then social justice activism in the online world. And as I mentioned earlier, this foundation is global, so it's based in the US, the UK, and Canada. Next slide, please. And the first thing, what I call throughout this ghU sites of tension, where we see conflict in the United States, is in response to Black Lives Matter. A lot of times we've heard people say all lives matter, and I'm going to make this into our first discussion point. So on the next slide, please, we're gonna see this question. And so I want us to start thinking about why all lives matter is problematic. And I think this is definitely something we've seen a lot in social media and has talked about with others. So we're gonna go into breakout rooms and discuss this. And I mean, I'm just putting forth for you to discuss, like, don't all lives matter? And as a challenge though, how would you productively explain this to someone who doesn't think all lives matter is problematic? I'm also going to put the questions in the chat or in the Slack, and then Nathan will send everyone into breakout rooms. Can I get some people to share some ideas that they discussed, please? Feel free to unmute yourselves.
Well, I guess in our breakout room, we kind of like talked a little bit about how all lives matter is really like a very basic and like it doesn't take into account a lot of the complexities that come with actually addressing issues of equality versus equity. And a big problem with it, I think, is that all lives matter is not a movement. Black Lives Matter is a movement. All lives matter is just a statement, a phrase that's used in opposition to silence Black voices and voices of people that support Black Lives Matter. And ultimately, one group is trying to create institutional change that is trying to address a very real problem in this nation, whereas the other group isn't doing anything. It doesn't seek or serve to actually create change to ensure all lives matter. It doesn't do anything that supports its message. All it does is try to bring down the other movement. And that's what I think is incredibly problematic and doesn't accomplish anything for society.
Yeah, Pranil, that was very well said. Henry, do you want to add on to that?
Yeah. So I pretty much talked the entire time in my breakout room. So I'm sorry to my group. But one of my parents is a state legislator for Nevada. And over the summer, when the movement was like all the Instagram graphics were like popping off, they asked me like why don't people say like all lives matter? Like they just didn't understand. And I was like, oh, okay, like I'm going to explain this right now. So basically I was saying how like, yes, all lives matter, but by saying that you're literally just like taking away and you're diminishing Black lives and other underrepresented lives and, the fight for equality. And the metaphor that I saw that like I used to help explain this was like, there's two neighbors and like one of their houses was on fire and, the neighbor's like, oh my God, my house is on fire. Like I need help. And then the other neighbor's like, why aren't you paying attention to my house? Like all houses matter. And it's like, okay, well, yes, all houses matter, but like we need to pay attention to the one that is currently on fire right now. And then this parent ended up, my parent who's like a legislator ended up voting for police reform in the assembly, and that ended up passing. So to see that like what I said was able to make like a tangible impact on Nevada, I think is pretty cool.
Yes, that's really amazing and such a good way to explain it to someone. So, yep, you checked that box right next to my challenge. Awesome. Next slide, please. Yeah, so just to put everything that Neil and Henry had already said, this is a great graphic that was designed by Natalie Grant at the art school in New York City. And on the poster, it says, we said Black Lives Matter, never said only Black Lives Matter, and we already know all lives matter. So we just need help with Black Lives Matter because Black lives are in danger. Or as Henry said, their house is on fire. Next slide, please. And now we're gonna go to the global movement, where really what I've seen in all my digging through the sources is that Black Lives Matter has become a rallying cry worldwide. Next slide, please. And the first place that we're going to look is Uganda, because of course our partners are located there. So in Uganda in June 2020, there was a protest. This was around the same time as all the other protests that were occurring in response to George Floyd's death, and 15 people were arrested. Next slide, please. And for Uganda, the site of tension is colonialism. To start with, the details behind this are that a majority of the group that were arrested, those 15 people, were mainly foreign nationals. So they were Americans, French, and Belgian. There were only 3 Ugandans, and news coverage focused primarily on a European American named Kelsey Nielsen. And so I did some more digging into Kelsey Nielsen, like who's this person? And it turns out that she's one of the leaders of No White Saviors, this advocacy campaign that from their website is aiming to disrupt traditional power structures between the Western world and the African continent. And No White Saviors organized this protest, and Nielsen on their team page is referred to as the white savior in recovery of the team. And what that means basically is that she used to engage in white savior practices and is supposedly more aware of her privilege now and is using it more properly. Next slide, please. So just a little bit more about this campaign or organization. On their website, they said, "We never said no white people. We just know they shouldn't be the hero of the story." And I just, next slide, please. And so it really got me thinking about like Kelsey Nielsen, what she's doing with No White Saviors, the organization, what she's doing with Black Lives Matter, the protests in Uganda. And so I want people to start thinking about what the difference is between a savior and an ally, and to consider some specific things like the intentions, the actions, and language of each group. And also tell me if you notice anything contradictory about what's going on with No White Saviors and Kelsey Nielsen in particular. So this is our next breakout room discussion. Nathan's gonna send everyone out, please, and I. Okay, so just like before, do a few people want to share what they discussed? And Maida dropped a note about HQ event and the differences between a savior and ally.
It's not like fully related to the question, but I thought it would be cool for people to like transition from just saying like, oh, I'm an ally, to saying like, oh, I'm like a true accomplice / co-conspirator of the movement, because we need like more activity. I don't know.
Yeah, like more actions, and not just saying you're one thing, but actually doing and living by those things.
Yeah, to add on to that, I think there's a very specific distinguishment between an ally and an accomplice, where and Maida alluded to this in her message, where an ally works within the system to advocate for individuals, whereas an accomplice works to dismantle a system that has historically harmed or oppressed individuals. So very two different types of wordages and characterizations. I will say that the utility between like an ally versus an accomplice is different, and I don't think an accomplice is necessarily better than an ally, because, for example, what if the system isn't completely flawed? In the case of Black Lives Matter, for example, I think an accomplice is apt, but there can also be a diversity of allies and accomplices.
Yeah, thank you, Nathan. And RT said the difference also goes to the power dynamics in play, how the individual places themselves in the overall narrative. Definitely. So one thing I saw in a video was how an ally, or perhaps even like an accomplice, would be organizing the resources for, let's say, like a video campaign and things. And so they'd be providing those resources or offering support, organizing these things, but they would let someone else take front and center stage and be the one that got like the visual attention.
Oh
yeah, go ahead.
No, you can finish what you were saying. I thought you were done.
Oh, okay. Well, I also just wanted to see if people talked about Kelsey Nielsen and what's going on with No White Saviors. Laura, go ahead.
Yeah, I was definitely confused about that, because I think that when it comes to, being an ally and like just saying, oh, I'm not a white savior, it doesn't really cut it. And also, I don't think that we know enough details to know what work that she did to actually try to get Black voices at the front of, the protest that she was doing. but it just seems kind of, yeah, like not really what needed to happen. But also one thing I wanted to mention was that, like, I think that this problem of white saviorism is really complicated and has been really simplified on social media by, like, I think by both sides, for and against, because there's like a really fine line between white people self-censoring and too worried to contribute, and then therefore not contributing and not helping at all with the movement. And then on the other side, helping too much, taking the attention away, like making them the center of it. And this fine line is like really being simplified on social media. So I think it's like, it requires a really long conversation to actually figure out how people can participate without being a white savior. But I think that just like kind of going with the easy response is like, you know, you see a lot of like, okay, white people, let's just step back. Like that in real life, it doesn't work out. There needs to be like really in-depth conversations about it. It's really not simple.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think just to elaborate and perhaps make things a little clearer, with No White Saviors, this organization, the leadership team has 3 people. 2 are women of color, and then Kelsey Nielsen is a European American. And so the ironic part is that being a part of this organization, and then the white woman gets the most news coverage, and honestly, not a lot of mention about the other 2 leaders of this org. RT?
Yeah, that was kind of just like the point that you just made, kind of just went to what I was gonna say, and just like her name is the name that we associate with the Ugandan movement of Black Lives Matter, and that kind of makes me a little bit angry because I feel like if it's Black Lives Matter, it's the Black names that need to be at the forefront of the movement, and I think that the fact that her name is the one that we see kind of makes me a bit wary about like how we should trust her, and like, is she doing this for herself, or is she doing this to bring attention to her organization called No White Saviors, as opposed to the actual movement and the actual plight of the people that need the help and need the resources that we could be giving them, but we don't know how to give it to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. And Jessica?
I just wanted to say that maybe like the media is also to blame for this, because they could also choose like where to put their attention. And I think inherently there's also like this very this colorism that already exists, so that could also be one of the reasons why they also decide to put so much of their attention on her instead of everybody else, even though the issues have nothing to do with like white women.
Yeah, so that's a great point to bring up, because it's not just an issue at the individual level, but also with institutions such as the media. Next slide, please. Thanks. So alternatively, another side of tension that has to do with colonialism, and I want to talk about this to end on this with Uganda, because this really shows the more positive and productive side of things. It's influencing positive change. And so what's going on is that the colonial streets, places, and parks name change movement has been around before the Black Lives Matter protests and everything that happened this past summer, but it's gotten more momentum since the summer. So it's an online petition that's to be taken to Parliament, and it's demanding the removal of the names of British colonial figures from streets and landmarks. So for example, in this picture, Colville Street is named after Major General Henry Colville, and he was a military figure responsible for waging expeditions in the late 19th century to depose kings and impose authority over kingdoms that existed for centuries way before British colonial rule. Next slide, please. And so what's going on behind this campaign is the fact that many people, Ugandans and foreigners, are unaware of the atrocities committed by the people being honored with these name locations. Partly what I've gotten is from a man named Apollo Makubuya, and he's a lawyer and the chief petitioner to decolonize Uganda's streets And what he said is, quote, "The reality is that African history before colonial rule was mainly oral and it was not written. It's passed on from one generation to another, and there are limitations presented by that kind of knowledge. So the little that exists in written form is either by European missionaries or explorers and colonial administrators. It is their lens that we use to see part of this history, and that history is airbrushed." And not to mention, of course, these names already, or these places, sorry, already had names before British colonial rule changed it to these Anglicanized names. So, for example, what we have been taught as Lake Victoria is not Lake Victoria in Uganda. It's named Nalubale. In Kenya, it's named as Namulo. I'm sorry, I'm not pronouncing these very well, but I'm trying. And Tanzania is named Nyanza. Next slide, please. And so also just a little more background about this movement is actually back in the 1970s, Idi Amin had done some of this work. And so I do want to acknowledge that Amin's rule was characterized by a lot of human rights abuses, a lot of political repression, ethnic persecution, nepotism, corruption, and a lot of people internationally in human rights groups estimate that between 100,000 and 500,000 people were killed under his regime. So I don't want to put any of that in the shadows. And then there is, though, this one positive thing that did come out in his rule, and I think it is interesting for us to look into. So first off, there was Malcolm X Avenue, named after Malcolm X, and then there was Nkrumah Road, and that was named after the person that led Ghana out of British rule. And so just also going back about Makubuya, the chief petitioner that I was telling everyone about earlier, another quote that came up that I found really meaningful is that it is not only because of George Floyd that we are doing this, but our petition has been given a new momentum because of the world today. Next slide, please. So now we're going into Japan, and just to give some background, like just like Uganda, when I started, there were protests in Japan in regards to Black Lives Matter, and this happened in Tokyo. Approximately 3,500 people marched, and there were multiple marches like throughout various weekends, so not just that one singular event. Next slide, please. And the thing, though, is in Japan, the slide of tension, there's two. The first one has to do with Japan and a lot of public responses saying that Black Lives Matter is an American issue. And part of that, what I think is that Japan generally sees itself as a homogenous society, and honestly, so does the majority of the world. But the consequence of that, of viewing this as just an American issue, is that there's really no commitment to advocacy. And so silence in all the things that I've found really leads to complicity. And also, worse than silence is this ill use of public platforms. So this is a video that came out by one of these news stations, and it really perpetuates these stereotypes, like caricatures with exaggerated muscles, angry faces, looters in the background. And so it's not just not contributing to Black Lives Matter, but it's contributing in a really harmful way. Next slide, please. And then the second side of tension has to do with biracial identities. So basically, these are two women that are, they descend from Japan, like Japanese ancestry and a Black identity. So for example, Ariana Miyamoto was Miss Japan in 2015, and she has a Japanese mom and an African-American dad. But a lot of people considered that she was not Japanese enough to win this title. And then Naomi Osaka, who has a Japanese mom and a Haitian dad, plays under the Japanese flag for the tennis team, but commenters had said that she needed some bleach for her skin. Next slide, please. So now that we've talked about Uganda and Japan and a little bit about the United States in the beginning, I want to hear about how everyone thinks globalization affects the Black Lives Matter movement, how racism endured by biracial public figures like Miyamoto and Osaka have made Black Lives Matter more than this American issue, and what role then does Japan have to play in this movement? Because we're nearing the end of meeting time, let's discuss this as a whole group instead of going into breakout rooms.
I don't know too much about Japan specifically, but I do know that in terms of at least like biracial public figures, what comes to mind for me is that a lot of the times people who are Asian that do marry into that like have like Black partners are looked down upon because they chose to make that decision. And they don't think of the love, or they don't think of, oh, they actually like this person, they just see that person as being Black. And I think that even though they say that they're homogenous, or they say that they're a homogenous society, there is that, like you were saying earlier, there is that backlash that she is biracial. And I think that like, unless we actively talk about the fact that these types of relationships are looked at differently compared to non-interracial relationships, then we can't really move forward. So it definitely, even other countries that see this as an American issue can't, because they perpetrate the same beliefs as well.
I think also, just like, I don't know if was anyone raising their hand? No. Like it also just speaks more broadly to the idea that with globalization, you can't expect someone to be from somewhere just because of the color of their skin. Like people are being born in every single country in the world right now, and like you could be any ethnicity and any skin color, and that's not going to mean anything about where you're from. And I think the fact that Japan is one of the countries that we're looking at during this presentation, I think is very important, because as one of the most homogeneous or expected to be homogeneous communities, it highlights that in all of the other countries within that spectrum, the issue is so much more present. So I think that was very interesting.
And Neil put a great comment about lots of countries considering themselves moral beacons compared to America, and sometimes allowing themselves to escape accountability for their own discrimination and prejudice. And I definitely agree with that. Sorry, Nathan's just texting me. Does anyone else have more comments to add? Just while everyone is thinking, I do want to emphasize that, with globalization, there really is no such thing as like this American or X country problem anymore. We're so connected, and we're only going to become more connected through race, ethnicity, and also just all these other mechanisms in society. And so it's important that these two public figures, they're Japanese and Black at the same time. There's no such thing as isolating their two identities or backgrounds. And so Japan has just as much as a role to play in the racism that they are facing. Yes, so next slide, please. And I also think as we're wrapping up, it's important to put in Uganda. I found this and I just thought about it a lot, because this Ugandan TV station, NBS, had their staff wear All Lives Matter t-shirts. The station later apologized on Twitter, but in response, a Ugandan activist and journalist by the name of Rosebell Kagumiri tweeted in response that a colonized mind is dangerous. And I also think, in addition, it really just brings in this talk of globalization, about how something that we originally talked about in the beginning of All Lives Matter being a site of tension in the United States is showing up in Uganda. Next slide, please. Okay, so I was hoping we could do the annotate option. We're not going to have that, but let's go to the next slide. Originally, this activity would be where I'm purposely making you choose between two options, whether saviors, which we saw in Uganda, or silence in Japan, which one would be more harmful nearing the end of meeting. So what is actually the thing, though, is that next slide, please. Or not like the next, yes, there we go. Actually, though, there's a secret, more correct option number 3, which is that one is just as harmful as the other, but definitely in different ways. It really just addresses how these issues can't be quantized. You can't say like one is more worse, like numerically or somehow. I don't know even how you would do that, because they're really both harmful, but they are in different ways because they're shaped by the history, the culture, the policy, the people, all those factors that are very unique to each setting, but they still ultimately come together to impact how the Black Lives Matter movement is going to protest or progress. Next slide, please. So to wrap up, I have this map, which is called the Halberdier map. And this was the most amazing thing I learned in anthro, because it's the world upside down. And what it's trying to do is countering white supremacy by challenging the geographical representation of the world that was really put forward by Western European powers. And so it suggests that, look, if we can turn the world upside down and depict the world in this new way, disrupting and transforming the original, so too can structures of privilege and oppression. And I think that's the main potential and driving force behind Black Lives Matter. When it's analyzed beyond the US, whether it's focusing on just different issues in each society, from like police brutality and the criminal justice system, to colonialism, to multiracial identities, the Black Lives Matter movement is collectively aiming for societal change. So to end things on the next slide, I want to reiterate what I started with, that of course, Black Lives Matter is about Black lives in the US, worldwide. And I think also, I hope that after this presentation, you can appreciate that there's just a lot of promising like power behind it, challenging the dominant group and our existing society order as a whole. And that concludes my internal presentation. I'm definitely going to stick around for people if they want to comment, talk, all that sort of stuff, because I can talk about this forever. But if not, I'm 2 minutes over, and I apologize about that. But I also think we had really great discussions.
All right, round of applause for Ashley. I'm gonna transfer all that noise to you, Ashley, because people are making noise for you. And again, thank you for such a poignant GHU. I'm gonna stop recording right now.